Hi, my name is Martin Perhiniak. Welcome back to the Digital Art for Beginners series here on PSD Tuts Plus. Today we are going to talk about light and shadows, how to shape forms. This is also really essential to know to be able to draw three-dimensional objects, just like the previous lesson where we learned about perspective. Without shading an object, you can't really describe value, and without value you can't describe form. I can show you a good example with this sphere. Now I just would like to show you that if I use the ellipse tool and I draw an ellipse next to this one, holding down the shift key I can draw a perfect circle. There is a black circle here, but if I pick a color with the brush tool and I hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, I pick the color and then I hold down Alt and backspace to fill in the vector shape with that selected color. Then I quickly use that gray color from the sphere. That's sort of the base color of the sphere. And I can see next to each other that the one on the left has the shading and the one on the right is just one simple color. You can easily tell that the one on the left feels like a 3D object, or it looks like a 3D object, while the one on the right, so it looks like a two-dimensional gray circle. As I said, using shading defines value, meaning we have different values from the brightest parts to the darkest parts. We have shadows, reflections, and all of these together are called values. And they help us to believe that this is actually a form of a three-dimensional object. Now that we know why it's important to learn about shading and lighting, we need to learn the types of lighting. First of all, there are two main light sources that we need to learn about. One of them is the natural light, which is the sunlight, and the other one is the local or artificial light. It's really simple to understand the difference between them, but first let's just start with the sunlight, which is the natural light. So here's a scenario where I have the horizon and the vanishing point, so it's a one-point perspective, as we already learned it in the previous episode. And I have three sticks here on the ground. And I would like to see how the shadows are going to work if I have the light source here on the top. So let's say this is the sun. Because the sun is far away from the earth, the light coming from the sun, it will be always parallel, which is a simple law that you just need to follow. But using that fact, when you have a perspective, a one-point perspective, you just simply need to connect the light source, the lines on the ground leading up to the vanishing point, and the top edge of the object. So in this case, I'm going to draw these guidelines or construction lines. First of all, for this stick on the left. So from the light source, tangent to the top of the object and crossing the line which goes to the vanishing point and which is also at the bottom of the object. I'm going to do the same thing here. So from the sun I'm coming down and I have the second construction line, and here is my third construction line. So now that I have the construction lines, I can draw the shadows. For the shadow I'm going to use a bit thicker line, and I'm going to use also black as my color, and I draw the first one here. So that is the shadow. That is the other one, and there is the third one. I just made them a bit more visible, but you can see if you use the sun as your light source, then it's pretty simple to define the shadows. And obviously this is a very simple object, a stick, but you can imagine if you have a more complicated object, you can just simply select the corner points and then connect them and create the shadow. This time the sun was behind the objects, so that's why we call this a backlighting scenario. But I'm going to show you quickly how it's working when you have a front lighting scenario. So in that case, I don't need these lines. I select the sun and I'm going to move it down. So now this is going to be a front lighting scenario, and I'm going to draw again the construction lines coming from the sun. I do exactly the same thing that I did, but now in the other direction. And in this case, the shadows are going to be here behind the objects. Really simple. Okay, like that. So you can imagine now the sun is in front of the object. So this is what we call front lighting. And the more I move the sun away from the horizon, the higher the sun will be and the shorter the shadows are going to be. So like when it's midday, the sun is on the top of the sky. If you want to use your lighting like that, then you have to place the light source, in this case the sun, further away from the horizon. And the closer you move the sun to the horizon, the longer shadows you will get, which means the closer you get to sunset or sunrise. So once again, this is natural lighting, which is, I think, most commonly used in art. But it's good to know about local or artificial light scenarios as well, and how to construct your shadows in that case. So let me show you an example for that. So here is a simple form, a box or cube. And this one is drawn in 3-point perspective, but it doesn't really matter. In this case, the only thing I would like to show is how to use a local light or artificial light and be able to define, based on the location of the light source, the shadow of this object. This one here on the top is the light source, and this one on the bottom is the ground plane. First of all, my construction lines that I'm going to use are going to follow these points here on the ground plane. So this is the first one. Then I'm drawing the second one. And the third one. And we need the fourth one as well. Even though we don't see it, we need to be able to define that point as well. So I'm going to just guess that. Remember, these lines here on the bottom has to meet somewhere in the distance. It look like something like this. And then from the top, I draw another line, which is almost straight in this case. Let me just draw this other one here as well, just to see how it looks. Yeah, something like this. So there's a point. I'm going to mark that point, and I just leave that point there. So now I can continue drawing. From the ground plane, I draw this last line here. So again, this is not really accurate. The other lines are accurate. But on the top, we see all the corner points of the box, which we also need to use. We need to connect the light source through these points onto the ground plane construction lines. So this point, which is on top of that point, will intersect here, and it will define the first corner's shadow. I'm going to do the same with the other corner. And because the light source is very close to the object, that's why we will have a very long shadow. Probably I will even need to extend the canvas, but let me just continue doing this, and I'm going to extend later. So this point will have to meet this construction line somewhere in the distance, and that point in the background has to meet this construction line, which is here. So now I'm going to extend the canvas. I'm using the crop tool. I'm selecting the canvas and I'm making it bigger, and I fill the background layer with white. I can mark the points of the shadow that I already have. So I have one point here. I have another intersection point there. And I just need these 2 points. There is another intersection point. And I have the last intersection point that we need to be able to define the shadow properly. So it might seem a bit complicated, but once you understand the theory behind local or artificial light, you will be able to guess the shadow of objects. And if you want to be very precise, you can always construct the shadow like this one. And once again, because the light source is very close to the object, that's why we have this very distorted and long shadow. To help you, I'm going to use the pen tool and I'm going to draw this shadow quickly for you. So we will connect these points. And even though that's behind the object, we can still connect it. So that's the shadow. Well, this should be behind the object. And we can turn off all of these construction lines. We could construct the shadow based on the local light. And in this case, the light is not parallel. So the light rays are not parallel. They are radiating from this point. And just as an experiment, I turn off this shadow and I extend my canvas to the top and I make this point, I extend the distance between the object and the light source. So here I have the construction lines. I'm going to need those. I'm going to select the light source and I'm going to move further up. Now if I switch back to the line tool and I'm constructing these lines once again, I'm repeating the same steps, and it's just a good way to practice what we've learned. I'm connecting these lines. I'm not doing an accurate job in this case, but roughly following the lines. Again, I see the points already. So all I need to do is select the pen tool and following these points. To be able to define the shadow, and then I just need to put this behind the object and hide all my construction lines. So you can see that once I move the light source further up, the shadow is shorter, closer to the object and less deformed, while if the light source is closer to the object, then this is how it looks like. By command clicking or control clicking on PC on the vector mask of the other shape, I can create a selection and you can easily compare the two to each other. Now let's use this longer shadow, and I would like to show something on the shadow itself. It's also good to know that once you are starting to draw shadows, that the shadow gets blurrier. The further away it gets from the object, the blurrier it will be, and more transparent it will get as well. To be able to do that easily in Photoshop, I usually turn my shadow layer into a smart object. So I right click on it and I choose convert to smart object, and then I go to blur from the filter menu and I choose Gaussian blur. I increase the radius of the blur. I probably, for this long shadow, I can even use something like 15 pixels, but if your shadow is not that long, then you can use less. Now I click on OK. And as you can see, because we use the smart object, our filter is going to be a smart filter, which has a separate mask. This is the filter mask. So that's what I'm going to select. Then I used the gradient tool with the default linear black and white gradient, and I'm going to draw from left to right because I have black and white colors selected. I'm going to draw from left to right a line which will define the gradient, and as you can see, from left to right the blur is getting more stronger So on the left we see sharp details, and on the right we arrive to a blurred detail. And this is exactly how in real life shadows work. And it's also good to use the same gradient mask for the object's opacity as well. So not just for blurring it out, but also for the opacity, because as I said, the shadow itself not just gets blurrier the further away it gets from the object, but it also gets more transparent. So to be able to use the mask that we already used for the blur on the object, we need to command click on the filter mask, which will select it, and then we just simply need to click on this icon, which will create the pixel mask for the layer from the selection. Now the only problem is that it works the opposite way, so we need to invert the mask, which is really simple. It's just a keyboard shortcut, Command I. But you can do the same thing from the masks panel. You can click on invert here. Now as you can see, this defines a really good shadow, but if you want to make it even more accurate, you can decrease the density of both of the masks. So let me show you. I have now the objects mask selected, and I'm going to reduce the density on that. So we still see a bit of the end of the shadow. Okay, maybe something like that. And then I select the other mask, the blurs mask, and I also change the density on that, which will reduce the effect of the blur. That means we will see a bit of blur everywhere, but probably that's something that we don't really need. I just leave it on 92%. It's more important to do it on the mask of the object, so not on the filters mask. So this is a quick way to apply a realistic effect once you have the shadow. And remember, the further away your shadow is from the object, the blurrier and more transparent it will get. But this is not the only shadow what we need to deal with. This is called the cast shadow, but we have shadow on the object itself as well. Now with an object like this, a box, we can easily define 3 different values, which is usually called 1, 2, 3, interestingly enough. And the values of these sides are defined again by the position of the light. First of all, let me fill the background with a color. I select the white background color and I use the brush tool. I hold down Ctrl, Alt and Command on Mac and I click to select the color wheel. This option is only in CS5. This is called the HUD color picker tool. And I think on PC it's Ctrl, Alt, Shift, right click to be able to use this tool. So I'm going to use something close to white, but not white, not pure white. So I selected a bright gray color and I'm going to press Alt Backspace just to fill the background with this color. And I might also use another layer. I'm going to fill that in with a bit darker gray value. Now that I have different colors also on the ground plane and in the background, it's easier to work with color values. And it's good to have these sides on separate layers. As you can see now I have it in one layer, but I would like to get them on separate layers. So I have this box and I'm going to use the magic wand tool and I click on this left side and I use the keyboard shortcut Command Shift J, or you can go to layer, new layer via cut to put that on a separate layer. Then I go back to the original layer, I select this and I do the same thing again. And now we have the 3 sides on 3 separate layers. Will be much easier to work with them like this. Let's call these sides 1, 2, 3, and I just use the type tool. I'm going to call this here on the top 1, this here on the left will be 2, and this on the right will be 3. And what I would like to achieve is to make a realistic lighting on the box itself. First of all, because the light source was here on the top, definitely plane 1 is going to be the brightest one, because this plane was the furthest away from the light source. That is going to be the darkest one. So the third one is the darkest one. That's the side in shadow. And the second plane is somewhere between the two. It's closer to the light source than the third side, but not as close as the first one. Now, usually, a basic rule is that we are thinking in percentages. 0% is the brightest and 100% is the darkest value. Now, if this side here on the top is 10%, then this side, the shadow side, is always halfway to black from the lit side. So let me explain this better. So if this one is 10%, then this here has to be exactly between 10% and 100%, which is the darkest value. In this case, that will be somewhere around 60%. If we want to be very accurate, then we can say 55%. If you want to use an equation, you can use this 100 minus side 1's value, which let's say in this case is 20%. So that's 100 minus 20 divided by 2 plus the value of side 1 will give you side 3. Let's do this again with 20%. That's the rule on the top, and we do an example. So 100 minus 20 divided by 2, and then adding side 1, which is 20, and will give us side 3. So let's say it's 100 minus 20 is 80, divided by 2 is 40, plus 20 will give us 60. I'll repeat the same thing. If this side is 30, let's say it's a darker lighting scenario, then 100 minus 30 will give us 70, divided by 2, that is 35. And we also need to change this to 30, because that's side 1. So 35 plus 30 it will give us 65. So if side 1 is 30, then side 3 will be 65. And so on and so forth. Now you know how to set the third side if you have the side 1. But we also need to know what's the rule with side 2. It's really simple. It's exactly between the two. So it's exactly between 1 and 3. So in the first case, for example, when it's 20 and 60, side 2 will be 40. This is again a bit more theoretical, but it's good to learn these rules. Just remember them, and you don't need to follow this exactly. You just need to know about it, and then you will be able to guess roughly the values on each sides. Remember, to be able to describe a form, it's always good to have a good 1, 2, 3 read, which means you should have different color values on each sides. You can easily practice this at home with a box and a light source. If you use a lamp and you try to move it around the box, you will see that you can find a point. Probably in this case, if I would lit this corner with a lamp, we will see all of the sides in the same color value. That is not a good 1, 2, 3 read. That's actually the worst case, because then we can't really see the form, because there are no values, we don't see the form. Whenever you start working on painting and you would like to show an interesting character or shape or any object, you are the one who can decide the lighting. So you can decide where you are going to put the light source or light sources. And now you know that you should always find a point for your light source which will define all the sides differently, so you will get different values on each sides of the object. That will really help you to describe the form or the shape. Now I'm going to use this 20, 40, 60 percentages. So I'm going to use the color picker, double click on it, and I'm going to type in brightness 20%. But as you can see, 20% in the hue saturation brightness definition means the opposite, because here 0% is black. So we need to invert these. So 20% in this case means 80%. And I'm going to lock the transparency with this little icon here for all of the sides, so I can easily fill them in. Using Alt Backspace, I'm filling in the selected layer with the foreground color. So I did already for the first side. Then I select the second side. I go back to my color picker and I type in 60. This is actually the 40% side. So I use Alt Backspace. That's 20 on the top. This is 40% here on the left on the second plane. Now I select the third plane. I go back to my color picker again and I type in 40% and I fill that part in as well. So that is 60%. 60% dark. So 20, 40, 60. Because the light source was somewhere here on the top, the light will bounce back and it will be reflecting back on this surface, and it will even reflect back on that surface. So all the parts of the cube close to the ground plane will be lit by the ground plane. That's what we call reflected light. Now, to be able to do that, I'm going to select the second plane and I'm going to use the dodge tool, which is great to create reflection. I'm using a big large brush with soft edge and I'm using for exposure 10%. I set the range to midtones and then I just simply start drawing with this tool here on the bottom. And I try to be gradual, so I go around it as well. And as you can see, we already have a reflection here on the edge, and obviously it's the strongest on the corner. But as I said, we will also see a bit of the reflection here on this side, so side 3. I'm using a bit on that side as well. Maybe that's a bit too much. Let's make the brush bigger and just be careful using it just tiny bit on the bottom. Now you can do the opposite using the burn tool. Once again, I set the exposure to 10%. I leave it on midtones, and I can even use it on this side, a little bit on this corner, something like that. And I can do the same thing on the top, a little bit darkening this part. Now you also need to take care of the shadow, because now in my case this shadow is 100% black, which is too strong for a shadow side which is only 60. Usually it's good to set the opacity in this case of the shadow back, and as you can see now it starts to be even more realistic. So now that we have reflection, a good 1, 2, 3 read, and also the shadow set up properly, I mean the cast shadow. But this is still just the beginning, because in this episode I was only talking about sticks and this box, but in real life we need to be able to handle round shapes as well. And that is the next topic, which I'm going to talk about in the next episode. So I'm going to talk about how to shade round geoforms like cylinders, cones, and spheres. We will learn much more about reflected light, and we will also learn a new term called core shadow. I know this episode was again a bit theoretical, but believe me, we need to discuss these principles before we get to creating artwork together. But we are getting there. We were talking about perspective, now we were talking about basic lighting, In the next episode, we will talk about lighting, but on round shapes. That's a bit of extension of this episode. And once we are done with that, we will be able to actually start drawing together. I hope you are still interested and you are still looking forward to learn more. And as I said, next week I'm going to talk about shading round objects. So thanks a lot for your attention today, and I hope I will see you next time.